anime wasn't always that popular. Um, Believe it or not, it's actually quite a newcomer in terms of American broadcast television. Really didn't start gaining traction until the 1970s, and that was at a time where cable TV didn't really exist as it is now, and you didn't have things like Netflix. The internet was really not in existence. The best thing you had was a BBS system. You had people did have VHS and Betamax tape players, but worldwide there were only about 100 movies being made for those machines, and they were very expensive. So it wasn't like there was any OVA products or anything like that to buy. So anime at first kind of had to claw its way into the market, and that's the purpose of this video, kind of talk about the beginnings of anime in America. Let me give you an idea of how television broadcast actually worked at that time. There were only three major networks: NBC, ABC, and CBS. There was a fourth network that sometimes existed, sometimes it didn't. It was bought and sold a lot, and so there was the mythical fourth network, which would actually become Fox eventually. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves there. So you really had only three major networks that were being broadcasted across America. Otherwise, you had smaller broadcast stations that only had like maybe 100 or 200 miles of broadcast, so that if you lived outside that bubble, you didn't get to see that programming for that area. So your programming could be totally different than your neighbors. So, and like I said, cable really didn't exist at that time. The closest thing to cable that we had was invented in Pennsylvania around 1948, where there was a town at the bottom of a whole bunch of mountains, and they couldn't get any reception, so some guy built a tower on top of a mountain, put an antenna on top of it, ran cable, jury-rigged the cable to it, and ran it back down into town, and that was the first cable system. So it kind of gives you an idea. During the 70s, HBO didn't really exist until the end of the 70s, and even then that was more of a thing that you had money to afford it. If you didn't have the money, which was what most Americans didn't have, you didn't really watch it. So what you had was broadcasted usually on that fourth network or the very local networks. And so just to kind of describe on how a television set at that time worked, here's a picture, and let me run it down for you. Okay, that top knob, where the numbers seem to go like 1 to 10 or 1 to 15, those are where you got your major networks. So you got your top three: ABC, CBS, NBC. And then you got the really strong signals that would come in on that dial. Now the weaker channels, the weaker broadcasters, would come on the lower one, where you can see it goes from something like 12 to 45 or 50. Some of them even had 56 on there. So it was like a car radio. You could tune in your station. And the broadcasts were antenna based, so obviously no cable. So you had to run a wire to the outside of your house to an antenna on top of your house to get these channels. Now these smaller channels, the one with the big numbers, so you'd like have like channel 45, which would be here in Baltimore, or where I'm originally from, Washington D.C. area, would have been WDCA channel 20, which would eventually become Fox. That was where I saw my first anime. So again, there was no VHS tapes to rent, to buy, to ship. There was no cable. This is how I got my anime when I was younger. And just to give you an idea of what they were showing, they usually made these shows appear in the morning for kids, because that's usually when kids were up really early in the morning, and maybe right after school time. And so that's when you would have your cartoons, afternoon or early morning. And that was your broadcast time. So if you were older, like an adult, say like, or not adult, but maybe your teenage years, and you really liked anime at that time, you either had to be really up and at 'em early in the morning, or you had to get back from school real quick, because again, you had no way of recording these things. Alright, so let me get to the top 3 or 4 anime that I watched as a kid under these conditions. Okay, just keep in mind, just as it is today, we get these things secondhand. So back in the day, back in the 70s, when I watched these were in syndication for local markets. So the years I give are going to be when they started syndication on WDCA, which is channel 20 in the DC area, Washington DC area, and you had to watch these at starting around 6:30 a.m. if I remember correctly. Okay, here's the first one. Marine Boy, which was released for syndication in the United States in 1968 and was run as the first two seasons throughout the 70s, and it wasn't until it was re-released that they added the third season. All right, here's one that's kind of famous for its title track. It's called Kimba the White Lion. Released in Japan in 1965. It would take about 5 years before it would make it to the United States, but starting around 1970, it went to heavy syndication. And it was on syndication for a very long time, I think even through the 80s. It was really popular. Another really popular one, which in Japan was called Mach Go Go Go, here in America we know it as Speed Racer, has a really lengthy history as being a manga in the 50s, just kind of like Kimba the White Lion, but more popular. And it was released in Japan in 1967. Again, it didn't come into the United States until the 70s, but enjoyed a huge run, syndication run, for a very long time, and got kind of a resurgence in the early 90s with when a music track came out by, I think, the Aphex Twins. All right, and the last one that I got to see, and this was actually in the afternoon as soon as I got home from school, so this would have been around 3:30 p.m., was Star Blazers, but this was towards the end of the 70s. In Japan, it was released as Space Battleship Yamato, but when it was released in the United States, it was released around 1978 as Star Blazers. Okay, so basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing reviews of these 4 older anime, just to kind of give you an idea of what we had to begin with. Yeah, I don't want to sound like the guy who walked uphill both ways to get to school, but honestly, with Netflix, you guys really had it easy.